All right, welcome to The Explainer. Now, I want you to forget everything you know about modern cookbooks, because today we are digging into something completely different. We're talking about the forgotten and, frankly, often shocking meals that literally stood between American mountain men and death by starvation in the brutal wilderness. So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into the desperate reality they were up against. Then, we'll look at the foundations of their survival, the real staples. After that, the good stuff, the hunter's bounty. We'll also touch on the absolutely critical role of indigenous food systems. And then we get to the really wild part, what they ate when all else failed. Okay, first things first, to really get what their world was like, you've got to understand the sheer, raw desperation they were dealing with every single day. This wasn't some weekend camping trip, not even close. This was a constant, brutal battle against the elements. So picture this, it's 1828. You're a trapper named James Beckwourth. A blizzard hits and pins you down for 9 straight days. You've got nothing left. No supplies, no fire. When a rescue party finally finds you, you're chewing on your rawhide moccasins and boiling pine bark just to stay alive. And the craziest part? This wasn't some one-off freak event. This was the baseline reality of a Rocky Mountain winter when you ran out of food. So you might be asking, how on earth did they avoid that fate? Well, it really came down to a few absolute essentials. Let's talk about the foods that truly fueled the entire fur trade. Okay, let's talk about pemmican. This was the single most important food of the fur trade, no question. Think of it as the perfect, non-perishable survival ration. It wouldn't freeze solid, it wouldn't spoil, you could eat it raw, you could boil it. The rule was simple. If you had pemmican, you survived. If you ran out, well, that's when you started eyeing your moccasins. And get this, the energy density was just off the charts. We're talking 3,500 calories per pound. A single 90-pound bag of this stuff could keep a man going for months. You gotta remember, in a world where calories were literally the currency of life, pemmican was worth way more than gold in the dead of winter. So a lot of the time, they'd boil the pemmican in water to make this thick, greasy stew called rubaboo. Look, it wasn't pretty, and it was super monotonous, but guys who ate it twice a day could pull 18-hour shifts no problem. Of course, there were other staples too, things like parched corn, which they'd chew one kernel at a time to make it last, and good old-fashioned jerky. Those were the crucial, lightweight fillers for their packs.
But hey, it wasn't all just monotonous stew. Not at all. When a hunt was successful, that's when things got good. That's when they could really thrive and get access to some specific, incredibly fat-rich delicacies.
Just listen to this quote from the legendary Jim Bridger. A man who had beaver tail and coffee wanted for nothing. And the beaver tail, man, that was the ultimate trapper's prize. And here's the thing. It wasn't really meat. It was a flat slab of pure fat and cartilage. They'd roast it right over the coals until the scaly skin blistered off, and underneath was this dense white fat that people said tasted like a cross between pork belly and the richest butter you can possibly imagine.
And you can really see what their priorities were when you look at their favorite cuts. The roasted buffalo hump, this massive mound of muscle just marbled with fat, that was considered the finest meal in the wilderness, period. Then you had marrow bones, which they'd crack open and just eat the marrow raw or roasted. It was like pure concentrated fuel. And buffalo tongue, that was boiled till it was tender and was actually traded like a luxury good.
But, this whole picture of a trapper feasting on buffalo, it's not the full story. It's actually really incomplete, because it ignores one of the most fundamental truths of their survival. And that brings us to a really crucial point. Think about the image you have in your head of a mountain man. It's probably that rugged individualist, right? One man, alone, against the vast wilderness. But was that the reality? I mean, could one person really conquer that kind of environment all by themselves? The short answer is no. The truth is, that whole lone mountain man thing is basically a myth. Survival was communal, and it was heavily reliant on the knowledge and food systems that had been engineered over thousands of years by indigenous tribes like the Shoshone, the Flathead, and the Nez Perce. In fact, trappers who married into these communities, their survival rates were dramatically higher. So what did they learn? They learned this incredibly sophisticated, multi-step process. First, you harvest things like camas roots, prairie turnips, and service berries. Then you process them, slow roasting in earth ovens, drying them in the sun, pounding them into cakes. And here's the critical part. You store them.
You pack them into rawhide bags and bury them in frozen caches for the winter. It was basically a food bank, accessible when game was nowhere to be found.
Okay, so what happens when the pemmican is gone, the hunt fails, and even those buried caches are empty? Well, that's when things get really grim. That's when they eat things that, frankly, we can barely even imagine today.
Just look at this. It really puts the stakes into perspective. On one side, you've got a good winter, roasted buffalo hump, beaver tail. On the other side, a bad winter, boiled rawhide, pine bark soup. The line between those two realities was razor thin, and it was a possibility they faced every single year.
Yeah, you heard that right. Boiled rawhide. They were literally boiling and eating their own equipment. See, the rawhide from their moccasins or saddles has collagen in it. If you simmer that for hours and hours, it turns into a kind of gelatinous, rubbery mass. It's not much, but it provided just enough nutrition to keep a starving body from shutting down completely. And you read the journals from back then, entire brigades of men lived on this stuff for weeks on end. And what about vitamins? Scurvy was a huge danger. To fight it off, they had to get nutrients that just aren't in dried meat. So they adopted the indigenous practice of eating fresh liver raw, sometimes still warm from the animal's body, right at the kill site. The taste was apparently pretty revolting, metallic and intense, but their bodies were screaming for those vitamins. It was a simple equation. Trappers who refused got scurvy. Those who could swallow their squeamishness, they lived. So, when you look at all of this, from the prized buffalo hump all the way down to the repugnant boiled rawhide, it all points to one simple, brutal, and absolutely undeniable truth about how they saw food. The core of their diet wasn't about specific recipes. It was a formula, a principle. And the goal was dead simple. Consume enormous quantities of animal meat and, this is the most important part, animal fat. That thick layer of fat from a buffalo's back, they called it depuo. They'd eat it raw, they'd roast it, they'd melt it into everything. Now, they didn't know the science behind it, of course, but they saw the results every single day. This high-fat principle, it was the absolute difference between life and death. The men who ate enough fat lived. The men who tried to survive on lean meat alone, they didn't. It's as simple as that. And you know, all this leaves us with a kind of challenge, doesn't it? A question from their world to ours. It really forces you to stop and think about our own relationship with food, something they understood on a level that, honestly, we can barely even comprehend today. Because for them, food wasn't entertainment. It was fuel. It was medicine. It was the only thing that stood between you and the freezing cold. Every single bite had a clear, immediate, life or death value. And maybe that stark clarity, that fundamental understanding of what food really is the most profound thing we've lost.